The Museum of Coastal Defense is formerly known as the Layou Mun Fort. This was one of the most horrifying barriers of defense in the territory, built more than 100 years ago. The fort was built by the British in 1887, intended to defend the eastern approaches to Victoria Harbour. It was also one of the most important battlefields during the Battle for Hong Kong. This ruined shelter was built in the 1910s as quarters for the Royal Artillery who manned the Central and West Batteries.
As you can see, there are many bullet holes which have penetrated these forts.
Britain first thought of Japan as a threat with the ending of the Anglo-Japanese alliance in the early 1920s. This threat also increased with the expansion of the Sino-Japanese War. On October 21, 1938, the Japanese occupied Canton, modern-day Guangzhou, and this resulted in Hong Kong being completely surrounded. Various British defense studies concluded that Hong Kong would be very difficult to defend in the likely event that they would be attacked by the Japanese. So, this encouraged more work to be done on new defenses throughout the mid-1930s, including the Gin Drinkers Line.
The Gin Drinkers Line was a British military defensive line against the Japanese invasion of Hong Kong during the Battle of Hong Kong. The British believed that this line could protect the colony from any Japanese attack or invasion for at least 6 months, and even called it the Orient Maginot Line. The Japanese too were convinced that the line would stop the advancement. This was only until they discovered that the line was very weak, as there were only 30 soldiers defending the Shin Mun Redoubt with a capacity of 120 people.
Defensive headquarters were located at Shingmen Redoubt, where concrete bunkers and a 240mm heavy artillery cannon were placed. There were 1.5 meter deep defensive channels to trenches which were named after London roads to help English soldiers into remembering them.
Our attack began shortly after 8 a.m. on December 8, 1941, less than 8 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor.
The defense forces managed to avoid and overthrow several raids by the Japanese, who were eventually overpowered, and the fort fell into enemy hands on December 19th. During the post-war period, the fort bore no defense significance, so it became a training ground for British forces until 1987, when it was finally abandoned.
This is only a medium tank made for the British Army in the Second World War. The Japanese achieved and maintained advantages through the air on the first day of the battle, as two of the three Vickers wildebeest torpedo reconnaissance aircraft and the two submarine walrus amphibious aircraft of the RAF station, which were the only military aircraft at Hong Kong Kai Tak Airport. They were destroyed by 12 Japanese bombers.
The Japanese destroyed the headquarters of the West Brigade and could not be forced out of the Wangnicheng Gap and the secluded southern parts. From December 20th onwards, the island was split up in two. One side with the British Commonwealth forces that were still holding out around the Stanley Peninsula, and the west parts of the island. With the ever-advancing technology of the 21st century, there were many weapons that had to be created. They had to keep modifying and creating new weapons in order to fight off enemies. To protect Hong Kong from attacking forces, weaponry was needed to defend the coast.
This was the largest weapon ever mounted on Layou Mun.
The rammer was used to drive the shell down the barrel. The worm was used to remove the dangerous pieces of cloth. The sponge was used to clean out the barrel.
This water tank channeled water to other boilers. Lubricants were stored here for the torpedoes.
These are the guns that protected the Hong Kong seaboards from Japanese planes. A number of these planes were owned by British forces in the 1940s.
This gun is on a hydro-pneumatic disappearing carriage, so it gave no time for warships to attack it. It's placed 54 meters up and fires 45 kg missiles up to 8,200 meters.
Breech guns were a good development because they were safer to use, as the cannonballs were shoved in from the back instead of the front. They were also quicker to reload.
Before, when the cannonballs were shoved in through the front, it was a slow process, but it was also more dangerous because it could fire anytime.
Okay, go.
This is the torpedo station used to bomb enemies that were threat to Hong Kong.
This is the torpedo station. These Brennan torpedoes were launched through that hole to attack their enemies.
The Brennan torpedo was a torpedo planted by Irish-born Australian inventor Lewis Brennan in 1877. It was powered by two contra-rotating propellers that were spun rapidly, pulling out wires from drums wound inside the torpedo. Variations in speed on the wires connect the shore station and allow the torpedo to be guided towards its target, which could be up to 2,000 yards away, at speeds up to 27 knots.
This is the West Caponier. As you can see, there is a well-built and fortified structure. It allowed defenders to attack with rifle power.
The Commonwealth forces decided to abandon the idea of holding on to Shamchun River, which was quickly occupied by the Japanese. Instead, they established 3 battalions in the gin drinkers line across the hills. These defenses were rapidly breached at the Shingmun Redoubt early on 10th of December 1941. The evacuation from Kowloon started on 11th December 1941 under aerial bombardment and artillery barrage. As much as possible, military and harbor facilities were demolished before the withdrawal.
By 13th December, the Rajputs of the British Indian Army, the last Commonwealth troops on the mainland, had retreated to Hong Kong Island. Maltby split up the defense of the island into an east and west brigade. On December 15th, the Japanese began an organized bombardment of the island's north shore. 2 demands for surrender were made on December 13th and 17th, but these were rejected. Japanese forces then crossed the harbor on the evening of December 18th and arrived on the island's northeast. When 20 gunners surrendered at the Sai Wan Battery, they were massacred. There were further massacred of prisoners and medical staff on Chai Wan Road.
Amanda, Karina,
Hagen, Andrew,
Tiffany.